Fill up your bellies with some fiber and come join us around the gathering hole. This is now a gathering hole. That's what I'm going to call it, Amy. We are doing a fiber episode. Are you ready, dietitian?
I'm pumped. I'm down to do the fiber episode. I was reading Fiber Fueled for some continuing education credits, so I feel like it's been top of mind. And we can talk also about my not so thrilled, the things that I don't love about Fiber Fueled, but there are some really good things in there too.
We can just start with that even. I mean, where do you want to begin? Should we give kind of more of an idea of what fiber is and what a prebiotic is, and then we could get into the fiber fueled conversation and then kind of branch off from there?
Yeah, certainly. I think, again, fiber broadly, I think there's two big categories. And fiber is a carbohydrate in food, and there's insoluble fiber and soluble fiber. Insoluble fiber is usually described as roughage, sort of. It's not something that we or gut bacteria can break down. So it kind of adds bulk. I think there's still some importance to insoluble fiber, but it's not necessarily going to be something that's going to like feed the microbiome.
So it's not a prebiotic.
No.
In that sense. Okay.
So not all fiber is a prebiotic. The insoluble fiber is not. And then the soluble fiber is a prebiotic for microbes, and microbes can break that down and metabolize soluble fibers. And I've heard it described a couple different ways too. I think you were saying Jason Horlak describes prebiotics in a way. I know Justin Sonnenberg in his wife's book, I think her name's Erica. I always forget his wife's name, which makes me feel just like the worst, that like I remember the guy and not the girl. But her name's Erica. But they have a book called The Good Gut. And basically in that book, I think he refers to them as Big Macs, kind of as a joke maybe. Microbiota accessible carbohydrates are fibers and things that feed microbes and help them grow and things like that. So I've heard like different wording for them, but to me, soluble fiber is probably the easiest one to remember. And
yeah,
I think that's maybe an overview.
I think you covered it pretty well. So fiber is going to be a carbohydrate, not a protein and not a fat. All fiber is not digestible by the human body and our like enzymes and acid and machinery. And then underneath that, basically it's this question of if you mix it with water, is it soluble or does it not dissolve into the solution? The unsoluble stuff, the stuff that would still be like suspended outside of the solution and kind of clumped, that is not fermentable by the bacteria. So that's what would be deemed roughage. As a side note, if you ever try to go on PubMed and search for the term roughage, I had this question arise from two different patients in the last few years. Like when they eat something with a lot of insoluble fiber or roughage, it comes out in their stool. Like they don't process that very well. And they wanted to ask what that was caused by. And I said, honestly, I'm not really sure. And I tried to type in the word roughage in PubMed. Amy, it was the hardest PubMed search of my entire life, and I got nothing out of it because 100% of the papers that use that term are talking about animals other than humans.
Oh my gosh.
So like dairy cattle. So what I was doing as a side note, so I typed in roughage and it popped up all these articles. And I was like, okay, roughage, not cattle. And then it was like, okay, we'll show you horses. Roughage, not cattle, not horses.
You should say again. Not animals.
Well, if I could have done that, I would have. But I had to have this big, long, sprawling search of like roughage, not cattle, not horses, not swine, not camels. No joke.
Gosh.
Camels. Like I was one by one, I was eliminating all of the non-human animals. And then I was left with no articles. So apparently human researchers just do not use this term.
That is wild. Yeah.
The other category being soluble fiber, which is one type of prebiotic. But as you said, not every fiber type is a prebiotic. And I would also say not every prebiotic is a type of fiber.
Right.
Because you could look at something like polyphenols, and those are prebiotic, but they're not a fiber.
Right. Yes. Okay. Exactly. Prebiotics are just really anything that's going to increase the growth of good microbes.
Hold on.
Oh, are you going to get like the official definition?
Yes. So as you were reading Fiber Fueled for this conversation, I busted out this like kind of old textbook thing that I had. I got on eBay. I'm not going to lie. I was perusing what they had. Basically, I might not be able to find it right now because I didn't bookmark it very well, but basically
this is how we prepare for podcast episodes. We don't.
Yeah, we don't.
Surprise, surprise.
But anyhow, basically the definition was that it's something that we can't digest, and it's something that selectively feeds certain microbes that are beneficial for human health. So if you found something and it selectively fed E. coli, that would not confer a benefit to the host. But if you fed bifidobacterium, then you could call that a prebiotic. And that actually, this brings up a really juicy point 6 minutes in. Do you see this? Because I see this all the damn time. People will assume that prebiotics are feeding the bad bacteria, like in the case of SIBO, or I had a student in FODMAP Freedom this recent time saying that, well, all of these prebiotics are going to feed Klebsiella. It's like, no.
Right.
That's sort of the point, is that prebiotics don't feed all bacteria universally.
Right.
They feed the good guys selectively. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to achieve the label of prebiotic. Do you see this a lot, though? I see this a ton.
100%. I mean, I think it comes from the mentality that you can starve SIBO by eliminating all fiber, which, again, doesn't make sense. And I think most people, too, when they take a prebiotic, either supplementally or they start adding more soluble fiber, different prebiotics into their diet, they might have some symptoms. And so they just say, well, it must be feeding the bad guys. But in reality, I think there's just so much shifting with some of the good microbes. And there's like microbes competing with each other. Your body's not used to that much soluble fiber. So it makes sense that, hey, you don't tolerate this quite as well if you haven't had these fibers in forever, maybe. I think that transitional period is something you see in papers too. So like in the papers, they'll say, people the first week might have had an increase in symptoms, but then their overall symptoms went down. So like maybe their symptoms started here, they went up a little bit upon starting a prebiotic, but then they went down way below the original baseline. And again, I think that's what freaks people out about fiber, is because they've been told all the time, maybe that it feeds the SIBO, feeds some of these bad guys. Then they start taking it and they're like, oh man, the people were right. I got a little more bloating and I feel like my bowel movements are a little weird, and that it must be feeding. It confirms this bad idea, and it keeps them stuck in the cycle of thinking fiber should be off limits. And again, it's really problematic because, like you're saying, prebiotics selectively feed good microbes and cause really positive shifts in good microbes. Now, that doesn't mean that every fiber is right for every person either. Yeah. Or again, like that you need to take like super high doses of certain fibers and prebiotics, and we'll talk about that too. But I think we have to utilize fiber as a tool to maintain a healthy gut. We need to understand it's really important, and we can't really be scared of fiber. And breaking down some of the poor ideas behind that is really important.
Yeah. And honestly, I don't know. I see so much as like bullshit marketing, scammy stuff now.
Yeah.
Like, you're going to scare a lot more people into doing your restrictive diet or rifaximin or your herbal antimicrobials or your elemental diet that you sell if you can reinforce this idea that every little symptom they get is because they're feeding the SIBO. And straight up, again, that is not substantiated in the research. That is not validated in the research. And we've talked about this, especially in the FODMAP episodes. Monash University, the people who actually like research the low FODMAP diet and do the majority of that research, they say very explicitly in their dietetics course, the mechanism for FODMAP intolerance is that the FODMAPs draw water into the bowel. They're osmotic laxatives. And then that increased water in the bowel creates pressure and distension And then for people who have irritable bowel syndrome, their nerves and their nervous system is hyper responsive to those sensations of stretch, and it's perceived as pain and bloating. And then it initiates this sensation. But nowhere in the entire Monash course did they talk about feeding the SIBO. And actually, there was a whole section about maybe SIBO is horrendously overdiagnosed and that the idea of starving and feeding the SIBO is probably not a thing. Like they call that out in their program. But here's a thought too, is that in one of the two books,
and just to, before you jump off the Monash stuff, if you actually read and look at Monash stuff too, the way they're talking about FODMAPs is not like FODMAPs, like again, like it's like this super intense, very negative thing. It's like, oh no, you can see if this works, and this could be a tool that might help you move forward. But it's like a much more rational, not fear-mongery type of teaching and implementation. And that's, I think, a really key point, is that when anything, it feels very fear-mongery and like, you have to do this or you won't get better, to me is usually a big red flag. And again, like I think the thing that's so interesting about Monash is I feel like it's a very balanced approach, and it's just sad because people have kind of grabbed onto that and then misused and abused it and kind of added different things to it like it's fact, when in reality that's not what Monash designed FODMAP to be used for.
It kind of reminds me of our conversation with Sarah Ballantyne, formerly known as the Paleo Mom. And she was talking about how she designed this whole thing called the autoimmune protocol. And one small part of that was the elimination diet and seeing if you could figure out your individual triggers. But then the internet bastardized it and ran away with it. And next thing you know, you have people treating AIP like it's the end all be all diet, permanent diet for people with autoimmune disease. Yeah, and like a lifestyle. And it's like only the diet, you know, at the expense of all the other things. And it's really sad how that happened. I feel like the same thing has happened with the FODMAP conversation. When you look at it in the academic setting, it's very clear what FODMAP can and can't be used for and what the mechanisms are, or at least what they're currently understood to be. But then you get out into the wild, wild west of the internet and you get into the SIBO sphere in particular, and you have even some perfectly well-educated doctorate level people talking about it in a way that A, doesn't make sense, but B, is totally contrary to what the research says.
Right.
And I kind of scratch my head sometimes. I'm like, bro, do you not have PubMed? Like, you have an MD degree or a naturopathic degree or a DC degree like me. Like, I know you have PubMed.
Right. Or like they'll take one study when there's like 20 that say one thing, and they'll take one study that says something slightly to the contrary.
Yeah.
And they'll use the one.
Well, I'll call it out. Like I was telling you recently that, and I like the guy's content by and large, but Ruskio did a video on YouTube not all that long ago, and he cited one single study that showed that the low FODMAP diet increased bifidobacteria and lactobacillus. And he said, oh, this diet treats dysbiosis. And I called him out. Like, I respect him enough that I want to politely call him out on his bullshit when I see it. And I commented on the YouTube video and said, bro, like, you can't cherry pick the one and only study that demonstrates that. There's literally 20 or 30 other studies that show the exact opposite, that FODMAP makes dysbiosis much, much worse. What are you doing? You're a smart guy. You can't be doing this. But hopefully he saw my comment. I never went back to look. But I also want to bring up this point too, is that, so again, like in one of the two books that I was going through for this episode, they made a point of saying that soluble fiber can bind and hold up to several times its weight in water. And again, that's not even talking about the osmotic laxative, like actually pulling water in piece of it. But if you take a couple grams of inulin or a couple grams of another prebiotic, you're going to get several times that amount of water in the bowel. And again, if your nervous system is hyper responsive to that, it can be a bit uncomfortable for a little bit, but that doesn't mean that's a bad thing. And it doesn't mean you should quit. But again, if you're looking at this through the lens of you have an overgrowth of bad boogeymen and you need to kill them and starve them at all costs, it's going to be scary. But right here, like in this book that I had pulled up, they were talking about inulin, and they said that the excess flatulence that could happen when you're first starting inulin seems to be dose dependent,
right?
Which makes sense. And
don't
they
take
said,
20 grams of inulin out the gate.
Start with a more modest dose and then gradually increase. But then they said that in studies where they went up to 10 grams per day, the effects are mild and not experienced as a point of discomfort in the studies when they survey people with like well-being and symptom questionnaires. And 10 grams of inulin is a pretty hefty dose. That's like probably 2 heaping teaspoons, I think, or maybe even tablespoons. So the fact that in the studies, you could go up to 10 grams a day and just have very mild discomfort. And then they said later on that it does dissipate after a week or two. Again, it's very contrary to what the SIBO universe is telling us.
Yeah, and it tastes delicious. I know we were talking about that.
Freaking delicious. It's like cotton candy.
Yeah.
There's no other way to describe it. It's powdered cotton candy.
Yeah, it's so good. We can talk about fiber fuel too.
Yeah, well, let's get into that, because I think what we've danced around up until this point is the side of the spectrum where people are saying fiber is bad, fiber is feeding the SIBO, fiber, is causing more problems, you should avoid it at all costs. Now let's go to the exact opposite side of the spectrum, where would you agree that the message in that book is basically like everybody needs shit tons of fiber every single day? Oh my God, hooray for fiber.
Yes. And again, I think that there's definitely some positive for that. Like, hopefully someone reading the book would think like, okay, I don't necessarily have to go to the extreme perfectionistic side of maybe what is touted in the book, but like I can do a little bit better on fiber. But as we know, some people do take it to the extreme. But yeah, I think when it comes to looking at the general population too, most people don't get fiber. We've talked about this stat before.
95% of the American population don't get enough.
But then a lot of people think they are. And I see this with patients all the time where they're like, well, I'm getting like a diverse array of things. Like I'm good on fiber. And I'm like, no, you're like averaging 14 grams a day, which I think is about the average for the American, like 10 to 15 grams.
To put it in perspective, the daily value for men and women is what, 25 and 35 respectively?
25 and 38 for the men.
And 38. So 14 is like, woo.
Right. Especially for like a guy too, in terms of like the percentage to your total. So yeah, I mean, like fiber is certainly really low. And so highlighting it as a really important part of a healthy microbiome is super critical. But I do think that there's a limit to what people can tolerate too, and that might be individual. So like this idea that you can just eat fiber and your gut's going to heal, it's just focused on this one aspect of nutrition and your gut will heal is overly simplistic and could lead people to the direction of too much fiber. And I don't know how much we've talked about this on podcasts, but I know we've talked about it behind the scenes that I've had some clients more recently with really high fiber levels. So I see the other end of the spectrum too at times where it's like, ooh, and in some of these cases, it's because their diet's so limited that they're eating a ton of like popcorn or a ton of certain things that just like raise their fiber up to really high levels. And I think that can aggravate bowel movement issues. Like it can lead to more constipation for some people, more diarrhea for other people.
Certainly
and again,
bloating, fullness.
Right. And I've seen lowering fiber help a lot with pain. I had a client more recently that was eating probably an average of 80 to 90 grams a day. Now it's funny because reading Fiber Fueled, he's like, we used to eat 100 grams like every day, like tribal cultures or, stuff like that.
But here's the thing, even if that is true, I'm not going to knock it. Maybe he found a book or something like, even if that is true, does that mean that our lives in the present day are going to allow us to process that much fiber? Right? Because like we're not leading the same life that we used to. So it's possible. And this was a flaw with the paleo logic too, is like, even if our Paleolithic ancestors and our tribal ancestors ate a certain way. The reality is that our environment and our lives are drastically different now. So maybe we need a slightly different diet than we did 10,000 years ago.
Right, exactly. And again, to be fair too, like paleo and maybe more tribal cultures, like their whole lifestyle revolved around like their job was to find food and to hunt food. Like that's not our job today.
Lots of movement.
Lots of movement, lots of sun, like lots of things that are probably great in a lot of ways. But like if we're working normal jobs and things like that, like it's not our job to go hunt and find food.
We're sitting on our asses right now, Amy.
I know.
We're not out hunting and foraging.
Right.
I would like to be. I'd like to be finding morel mushrooms right now, but you know.
I definitely have seen individuals that are exceeding the recommendations by such an extreme point, and even some that are less extreme, like even some that are maybe. I just talked to a client more recently who was a woman, and I think she was maybe more averaging around like 40, maybe 50 grams a day. And I think she was eating like a fairly higher calorie point than like maybe a typical woman because she's active, which plays into things too, because if you're eating more as a woman, you might want to exceed the 25 grams because that's kind of based on calories typically. So like if you're eating less as a woman, you would get less grams per calories versus the male side of things too.
Well, I think let me rephrase it a little bit so we don't lose people. I think what we've talked about behind the scenes and maybe once on the podcast is that if you're eating enough calories to sustain yourself and you're not active, it's quite a bit harder to fit in all the vitamins and minerals and fiber into that lower calorie count. But if you start working out a ton and you're really active, now you have all of this wiggle room, so to speak, because you have 3,000 calories to play with. Right. It's like, it's harder to fit in all of your nutrition into like 1,800 calories versus 3,000. So when you start becoming more and more active, I think we were talking about this when you were breastfeeding and you were eating a lot more calories to sustain the breastfeeding. And you were like, yeah, I'm like hitting all my metrics on Chronometer. This is great. But it's probably because I'm eating a lot more calories.
Right.
But we also talked about, it is kind of weird that the daily value is not adjusted for calorie count. It's just all women, regardless if you're an Olympic athlete or a couch potato, every single woman needs this much riboflavin. And like, that's a little bit weird if you stop to think about it, but yeah.
Right. It's interesting because there are recommendations per 1,000 calories for grams of fiber. So like there's a recommendation for 14 grams per 1,000 calories. So like if you're a woman and a very active woman, maybe you need 2,500 calories a day. You could kind of think like, oh, maybe I need like closer to like 30 or 32 grams based on that. I'd have to actually do the math. Yeah, that would be like 32 grams then.
You're
ish.
Pretty close.
Somewhere in there. Yeah, I mean, I think there could be some adjustments, and I don't think you have to be at the 25 gram or something. Like, there's still room to go above that. But I do see that some people, again, even if they're like I said, the woman that I was talking to was maybe falling 40 to 50 grams. And we were going to experiment slightly reducing that and seeing how her symptoms felt, but still getting plenty of fiber too. And I see this a lot with people eating like lots of plant foods.
Vegans and probably to a lesser degree vegetarians, I would imagine. Just, massive salads this big.
Well, it's funny. And again, I would say more recently, there's like 3 or 4 people in the recent history, maybe the last 6 months that I've worked with that have been too high fiber. And most of them, it's because their diet's been narrow, whether it is like maybe they're vegan, maybe they're, again, restrictive from like a gut standpoint and got stuck. And it's like, well, the only way I can get calories in is if I eat these foods that I feel comfortable with. But in reality, it actually isn't comfortable.
I know there was one case that sounded like they had disordered eating as well. I remember that one in particular. And I was actually going to make this point, and then maybe we could tangent off the too much fiber topic. Because what I want to be mindful of is we want to give more airtime to the problem that's far more common. if we talk about too much fiber for 10 minutes out of a 60-minute episode, we run the risk of people kind of skewing the importance of that in their brain.
Right.
So I want to point out pretty much all of the people that we've seen doing this are either vegan or they have such a weird diet that it should be kind of obvious to anybody else. Like, not obvious to the person because they're sucked into their own stuff at that point and you can't be objective anymore. But if the person who is eating 2 or 3 bags of green beans every single day talked to literally anybody else on planet Earth, they'd probably be like, oh, that's kind of weird, man. Or the guy who was eating just like bags and bags of popcorn every day to get his fiber up, probably normal people would be like, man, that's a lot of popcorn. You should maybe like cool it.
Well, and I think that the only other exception to that rule is I have seen sometimes people supplementing with like prebiotics or fibers when they might not, like it might take them too high, if that makes sense. So I've had a few individuals that have done that where it's like, whoa, you're already at like a fairly high fiber standpoint. You don't need to throw on like a PHCG supplement or a Metamucil or like some sort of fiber that you're throwing on top of that. I've seen that in a few cases too.
Yeah. I actually just saw one of those recently. An established patient who I'd worked with years ago, and she was doing great. And like SIBO was gone for years. She all of a sudden popped up on my calendar again. And I was like, I'm so happy to see you, but also why? Like, why are you here? And basically what had happened was she was doing great. She was maintaining all her stuff and she felt wonderful and she was eating a very diverse diet. And then she saw on Instagram, there was a like menopause hormone guru influencer who formulated her own prebiotic product. And she was saying that it was like the best thing in the whole wide universe for everybody who's postmenopausal. And so this patient had been struggling a little bit with more menopausal related symptoms. And she thought, oh, I'll get that. But she was already eating plenty of fiber to begin with. And then she threw in a whole ton more and it just kind of exacerbated some stuff. So I basically the whole point of the call was, okay, cut it out and just know. And I would say the same thing of fiber fueled, right? Is that you have to sort of be aware when you might genuinely be the exception and not the rule. So again, 95% of the population does not get enough dietary fiber. So the Instagram influencer who's promoting fiber, the fiber fueled guy who acts like the sun rises and sets on dietary fiber, for 95% of the population, their messaging is going to be really helpful and correct and wonderful. Versus if you can have some sense, maybe with tracking and chronometer, which we tell you to do every episode, but nobody does. Like if you track your nutrition a little bit and you find out, oh, I'm actually hitting the mark for real on my dietary fiber. Now, when you see those messages and those Facebook ads, you can know, oh, that's not for me. That's for the 95% of people who really need that information, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And again, the chronometer is such an easy tool that you can use just to kind of, and again, I don't think it should be an everyday thing. For most people, it should not be something that you're like relying on to like check all the time. But it can be a really good assessment tool. So understanding, here's generally what I eat for like 3 days to a week. Am I typically hitting fiber? And if not, I think that we can certainly give some tips on how to increase fiber. But again, it's helpful just to see where you're at because fiber can be a little bit Goldilocksy. I think there's a lot of room, though. It's not like there's this, like it has to be just right.
26.1 grams.
Right. It doesn't have to be. All right. It doesn't have to be quite like that. But if you go too far one way and too far the other way, usually you're going to have trouble progressing with your gut goals.
Would you say if you're too far to either extreme that shit gets weird?
Shit does get weird.
Shit gets weird, people. But yeah, and I guess one of our points with mentioning chronometer here is that it's a widely available free tool that you could use that will help you assess fiber. And the importance here is that 33, I think, % of the American public, from one study that I read, 33% of people believe that they're getting enough fiber, but they actually are not.
It's actually 2/3. So it's like 66% from that same study where they looked
right.
at.
That's right. Yeah, it was more egregious.
It was like close to 70%. It was like 66%.
So most people are straight up in denial.
Well, and I think it's poor education because if you go to the grocery store, and again, I would say more often than not, people are eating a lot more processed foods. And if you look at the processed food containers, they're like, has whole grains, good source of fiber. And then there's like 2 grams of fiber in it. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with having something that has 2 grams of fiber. But if you think like, whoa, I'm doing so good fiber-wise, and it's a 2 gram of fiber, it's like, oh, it might be like an okay source of fiber. I wouldn't say it's great. So there's a lot of weird marketing things going on in the food industry that make you think you're doing so much better than you are. And sometimes people get in trouble for that. And I think way more companies should get in trouble for that. I know I did this project in college where I looked at like food marketing, which is so random because I was in business. And Frosted Mini Wheats had this big lawsuit against them because they had this whole campaign. I still remember it on TV talking about how kids that ate Frosted Mini Wheats, how they had better focus in school and better concentration in school. But guess what the control group was? No breakfast. So like the control group.
Duh.
So it's basically like, did you eat breakfast, which was the Frosted Mini Wheats, or did the kids not eat breakfast? And then that was the conclusion then, that the Frosted Mini Wheats people had 30% more focus or something, or however they tabulated it. But it was on the box. And it's just so crazy that they could do stuff like this. And I think they've pulled back a little bit on some of the health claims on some of the boxes after a few other cases like that. But it is insane.
Cheerios had one of those too, right? Like they used to say it was good for your heart or it prevented heart disease. And now they say part of a heart healthy diet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. That's so stupid that the control is just no breakfast.
I know. And again, it's like, no wonder people too are slightly in denial when you have claims, like weird claims on processed foods that just are not good. And also I remember too, like the term natural is like really unregulated. So people put like natural or these weird terms on boxes. There's no one patrolling terms at all.
A lot of terms are unregulated.
Right.
Functional medicine, any Joe Schmo can say that they do functional medicine.
Right.
There's no like real certification process. There's no credentialing. It's just, you could have a person who took one seminar. You could have a person who read one single book and they're like, ooh, I want to do this. And then you could have somebody who has dedicated decades to this kind of field. But yeah, a lot of stuff is unregulated, particularly in like the food and supplement industry. It might be worth just pausing for a quick second too. So correct me if I'm wrong, dietitian in the house. When they say something is a good source of something, I think isn't the way that they can claim that like if you were to get all 2,000 calories a day from Cheerios, would you get enough dietary fiber if you got 100% of your calories from that food? I feel like I vaguely remember that being the definition.
That could be right. I can't remember exactly. I know they usually have like gram amounts, like even with protein, and maybe that's how they do it. But even like, it always cracks me up. The good sources of protein options are like, I mean, they're sources of protein that aren't bad, but I wouldn't say they're good. Like meat and chicken and stuff that doesn't have like good source of protein across the top are usually like the best sources of protein. But yeah, like you'll have something with like, 8 grams of protein or something. And it's like, that's not bad at all. Like that's nice. Like you get some protein from that, but I don't know if I would list it as great source of protein. So I think that there's a lot of weird games like that in the food and beverage like industry and how they're touting products. And it's strange. It is really weird. But that's probably why the fiber thing's so confusing.
Yeah. Well, I think also there's this element that a lot of the vegetables that people typically think of as healthy, like I'm picturing a salad or carrots or cucumbers, don't actually have that much fiber in them. That has been a point of discussion in the Dineza household because my husband, we eat a lot of veggies, but one of our go-tos is to have a nice big salad and like baby carrots and cucumber dipped in hummus. And my husband especially is perpetually shocked and horrified that the big salad he ate or the baby carrots that he just ate really were not getting him that many fiber points in the grand scheme of things.
That's a really good point. Because I've seen a lot of people like that too, where they're like, I'm getting plenty of plants, but it's like, yeah, but maybe you need more carb, like starchy carbs. And I see that being a big thing. Like if someone's low carb, usually, not always, but usually you can kind of start to see that their fiber dips a bit and they're not hitting their fiber goals. But I think, again, another thing too, if someone's demonizing fruit, like fruits can be a great source of fiber. Starchy carbs and things like legumes can be such great sources of fiber too. Like, nice thing about like beans and legumes is you don't have to eat a ton of them either. Like, it's not like you have to eat like a huge amount of beans to get tons of fiber either. Like, you could kind of garnish them on things, use them in soups, and get some good fiber. But yeah, I see a lot of people who are a little bit more on the low carb. And I think SIBO diets and some of the stuff we see just generally slates people to be a little bit lower carb. Not always, but I would just say there's a general trend to be on the lower carb end. Carbs get more demonized. So that's something to consider as well. Like maybe even just beefing up your carbs and adding in some like healthy starchy carb sources might help with your fiber and getting soluble fibers in your diet.
I feel like the goal with so much of this is like, eat carbs, but don't only eat carbs. Eat fiber, but you don't have to be a vegan. Eat meat, but you don't have to be a carnivore. Like, can we all just meet somewhere in the middle? Like, eat fat, but you don't have to be keto, for crying out loud. Right?
It's like the theme of our podcast in general is finding balance is probably the best method. If you're going to extremes anywhere, it's not going to be beneficial.
Yeah. And I have a quick share on that end too. So going back to the idea of too much fiber and how that gets some airtime. So what's interesting is, I think even on this podcast before, I've mentioned that there's a good way and a bad way to do any diet, including keto. And I believe at the time when we did our keto episode, I cited Mike Mutzel for having like what I thought was a healthier version of a keto diet. And this was several years ago. He, was showing he had these big, diverse, beautiful salads, and he would get lots and lots of veggies and fats and oils and avocados and stuff. And I always look to him and his version of keto as being like one of the healthier versions of keto that was out there versus the people who just eat like cheese and fat bombs and coconut oil and everything. Interestingly, he's gone much more carnivore leaning in the last couple of years. And I saw he did this video where he was talking about it because people in the comments had accused him of cherry picking data and being, just on like a meat fueled rampage. He told his story and he said, no, like if you look back at my previous diet, I was largely vegetarian or vegan, and I had a lot of plants, and I had this big backyard garden, and I was reading the research on the microbiome and the fiber, and I really wanted to do that, but I didn't feel good. And now that I'm eating almost exclusively meat, I feel great. But I was thinking to myself, I'm like, yeah, but I wonder, were you one of these people who was getting way too much fiber? And again, it was like you swung the pendulum so aggressively into the high fiber world that of course you kind of felt like shit doing that. Like, did you have to swing the pendulum all the way back to the other side to do carnivore? Or would you have been able to find some balance eating a more balanced diet? It's very interesting too, because he has a degree in nutrition.
Yeah, it also just makes me a little sad too, like the extreme ends of everything, because that individuals like that are that dogmatic about their diet, whether it's, keto and eating a particular way or him transitioning to carnivore, even on the fiber fueled diet, we were talking how he had a grocery list that's like 5 pages long. It's like, I personally don't want to spend this much time and energy like perfecting my diet.
And you're a dietitian.
Right. And doing something so extreme and so perfectionistic with my diet, it's, to me, I want to have a diet that fuels me properly and nourishes me properly so I can do everything I want to do. But that's not my goal, is to just like have this perfection diet. And I'm so hyper focused on it. And to me, it's kind of sad when people get so locked in, because I've been there before. But I want people to probably spend less time and energy thinking about their diet. And that doesn't mean I want their diet to improve while thinking less about it. You know what I mean? And that's totally possible.
So what Amy's saying is you're allowed to eat Doritos for breakfast, Skittles for
That's
lunch,
not what I'm saying.
and Panda Express for dinner, and you're going to be fine.
That is not what I'm saying, but I'm saying usually the patients we work with and the people that are sucked into like the wellness holistic space are spending so much time like trying to go to these extremes and thinking about food and meal planning and meal prepping and all this stuff. And it's like, you could probably broaden things, find a middle ground, and nourish your body properly and not spend 3/4 of the time you're spending on your diet. And you could use that time to actually do things that you enjoy and love. And who knows, maybe like Mike Mutzel loves manipulating his diet and biohacking, and I don't really want to totally judge that. But at the same time, a lot of people that I work with, majority, again, the goal is to think less about the diet while nourishing better. Like, how can you make this easier on yourself? Because it doesn't have to be perfect or like the extremes like is touted. It's just wild.
Well, and this maybe brings up the idea of priorities and goals.
Yeah.
Right. So for somebody like Mike Mutzel, perhaps, or like there are people out there in the biohacking field that are super proud to tell you that they are reverse aging. They biologically like have signs that they're getting younger by the day, Amy. But if you look at what they're doing, literally their entire life revolves around like wake up and do a cold plunge, then get in the sauna, then do red light therapy, then go for a run, then do this. And it's like, there's no room for actual life. And at least for me personally, I don't see the point in prolonging my life if I'm not actually living my life.
Right.
You know what I mean?
It's a really good analogy.
But it's like, if that's your goal, if that's what's getting you money and followers, and that's where you find fulfillment, and you frankly just don't care about the rest of your human existence, and you just want to be known as the guy who lived to be 120 years old, like, I'm not going to judge that path. I'm just saying, I don't think that that's desirable or practical for most people. I think that most people want to have family and friends and trips, and they want to enjoy food a bit, and they want to be healthy enough to enjoy their life and enjoy their connections, and they don't want to die prematurely, but they also don't necessarily need to live to 120. So it's like just thinking about your goals and your values and looking at websites and podcasts and YouTube videos through that lens. You know, it's like, this might be something that makes this person really happy, and that's okay. I'm happy for them, but this doesn't need to be my journey.
Right.
And
no,
yeah, maybe Mike Mutzel is in that camp. Maybe he wants to do the reverse aging thing, or maybe there's some other goal that he has in mind, but that doesn't mean that normal people need to strive for that same thing. I think that most people would do really well, and they would have a good quality life, and they would have decent longevity if they just found balance in their nutrition and their behaviors.
100% agree. Well, do you want to talk about, we kind of briefly mentioned some stuff, but I don't know if there's like little tips you give to try to increase fiber for your patients, like in terms, if you find yourself kind of on the low end, what kind of stuff you like doing?
Yeah, I think the first question, if somebody is low in fiber, the first question should probably be like, do you feel like you could tolerate FODMAPs decently well at this time? Right? Like, if I had somebody who had been through a 3-year SIBO battle, and they had done elemental diet and low FODMAP a million times, and they were stuck on low FODMAP, and every little FODMAP makes them bloat, I'm not necessarily going to recommend, just eat some apples. That's a good source of fiber.
Right.
Although that is the end goal for the person to get there, versus if like I had a guy that I'm starting with recently, actually. He's only ever been to the GI doctor. He's never done any of this other shit.
Oh my gosh.
The wife actually heard us say on the podcast, wouldn't it be magical if we could get somebody like that? And she called the office. It was great. And she was like, that's my husband. So anyway, somebody like that who hasn't been through the whole rigmarole of low FODMAP, SCD, biphasic, whatever, if he came back with low fiber intake, I probably would look to a lot of the high FODMAP foods in particular. Or with somebody like that, you could literally have them Google foods that are high in fiber and just treat it like a menu of sorts. Like, oh, I really enjoy eating this and this and this, so I'm going to add those in right away. And like these things I don't have a lot of experience with, but maybe I could like go on Pinterest and find a good recipe and experiment with it. That's kind of my initial step, I guess. How about you? What do you think?
Yeah. Again, usually sometimes I'll look at their macro balance and be like, well, this person, if you just eat more carbs, I think you'll fill the gap. So like sometimes it's simple like that. I think what you're saying too, if someone's been historically sensitive to FODMAPs or different fibers, sometimes I will suggest doing a little supplementing while they kind of work on adding fibers in. Something that's usually helpful for more sensitive guts like PHGG or sometimes Hologos or like HMO type stuff, I think can be a useful tool to bridge the gap sometimes for individuals. So I do that at times. But yeah, I think it's not a bad strategy, like you said, just to kind of like look up what you would like to eat and different ways to kind of add that into the diet.
Sometimes nutritional recommendations are not very practical for the person. And it's like, okay, you can force somebody or you can like mandate that somebody do this cleanse or this detox. But if they don't actually enjoy the foods that they're eating, they're only ever going to muster the dopamine to do it for like a month or two. And then they're going to fall back to whatever they were eating before. But if you could have a conversation of like, well, what do you actually enjoy eating? And what do you think you could just, like it doesn't even have to be a forced thing for you. You would actually really enjoy avocado toast, or you would actually really, really love to have an excuse to have like a big, beautiful salad every day. Or again, like, hey, why don't you eat some potatoes? If you told me right now, Amy, to eat more potatoes, I would be thrilled.
Yeah.
Thrilled. So, it's like, let's start with something that's a really easy win in the beginning. And then you could start branching out and trying new vegetables and trying new fruits and like trying different things. But I also like the idea of bridging the gap a bit with a prebiotic supplement. I think also a butyrate supplement could be helpful, especially for people who have been low FODMAP for a while and they're not really getting the FODMAP type prebiotics, because a large part of the benefit of fiber is that when the bacteria eat the fiber, they make you stuff. One of those things being butyrate. And if you've been low FODMAP or low fiber for a prolonged period of time, you just probably aren't getting a great deal of butyrate production. So sometimes I'll actually slap people on a butyrate supplement for like a month or 2 or 3 while we're trying to increase the fiber in their diet.
Yeah, butyrate, again, like you said, I think is a great tool because it can help with tolerance building a bit too. It seems to help with hypersensitivity. So again, I think that's an awesome recommendation too.
Oh, wow.
I think too, if you are sensitive as well, try to maybe find foods that you can tolerate better now and increasing those as well. This is something like if someone's really like pretty low calorie and they're like, I don't know how I'm going to get calories in. It's like, well, let's start with like the foods you tolerate. Now there's some cases where they're eating 5 foods and we have to branch out. There's no getting around it. But if someone's kind of still eating enough to where you can say, okay, let's bump up potatoes because like those generally seem okay. If we can beef those up to get your carbs up and get some fiber up, that's a good tool. So sometimes too, it might be better focusing less on diversification at the beginning and more just on like, what can I eat and how can I utilize the foods I can eat to build fiber right now, and then work on the diversity piece a little bit later.
Yeah, I think that's very reasonable too. And keep in mind, people, we have a whole library of episodes for you to check out and learn from. I actually just saw a comment on a YouTube video of ours recently, and somebody had suggested a topic for an episode about food reintroduction. And I was like, oh, sweetie, we have two, actually. We have one episode about bringing back the carbs, and we have another episode. Granted, it was in season 1, so the audio was kind of shit. But we have a whole episode, I think it was like episode 34, about food reintroduction.
Yeah.
Now, maybe we could revisit that topic more now, because I think we have grown clinically and we probably have more tricks up our sleeve at this point. And again, it would be better audio quality if we re-recorded the thing. But we do have episodes entirely dedicated to food reintro, carb reintro. So yeah, check those out if you weren't already aware that they exist.
Yeah. Good ideas, man.
Yeah. All right, Amy, let's take this bad boy home. Can you remind the good people where they can find you?
You can find me on Instagram at Amy_Hollenkamp_RD. That's pretty much where you could find me.
Bravo.
Yeah.
I'm also on the gram. I'm getting back into it.
I know. I've been enjoying your gram content.
Thank you. So I'm on the gram as the Gut Microbiome Queen. And likewise, I have a YouTube channel by the same title. My YouTube channel is Dr. Daneza Gut Microbiome Queen. But yeah, come check us out on the rest of the internet. We post similar topics and similar kind of educational stuff, but with slightly different flavors on our other platforms. And in the meantime, we will see you right back here for another episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast before you know it. So until then, toodaloo.